Today, we're ranking every major special operations force of World War II, not just by body count or mission success rate, but by something harder to measure. Did they actually matter? Did they bend the war? Some of them were brilliant ideas, destroyed by the wrong generals. And some of them, frankly, were sent to die by commanders who had no idea what they were doing. Let's start at the bottom.
The lower tier, talent wasted, blood spilled. 9. Imperial Japanese Army paratroopers, the Taishin Shudan. Picture this: February 1942, the oil fields of Palembang, Sumatra, deep in Dutch colonial territory. Japanese paratroopers fall from the sky in the dead of morning, seize the refinery before the Dutch can blow it, and hand their empire one of the most strategically valuable prizes of the Pacific War. For one brief shining moment, the Taishin Shudan looked like a force that could change everything. And then their commanders ran out of good ideas. The Japanese Army's paratrooper corps had the bodies, they had the training. What they didn't have was any coherent strategy for what to do with elite airborne forces beyond that one spectacular debut. Their next major deployment? The Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, 1944, a chaotic operation launched into the teeth of American air superiority, with no real coordination, no realistic objectives, and almost no survivors. The brutal truth is this: the Imperial Army never truly understood what Special Operations Forces are for. They aren't shock troops for lost causes. They're surgical instruments. Use them as a hammer, and you waste the blade. The Taishin Shudan spent the last 2 years of the war being sent on missions that talented men had no business dying on. High courage, zero strategic vision from the top. That combination is a death sentence.
8. Italian Decima Flotilla MAS, the Sea Devils. Now here's a unit that genuinely haunts me because they were actually ahead of their time. The Decima MAS, the 10th Assault Vehicle Flotilla, were maritime assassins operating out of the Italian Navy. They pioneered human torpedoes, men riding slow-moving underwater vehicles, wearing primitive diving gear, sneaking under the hulls of anchored British warships in the dead of night and clamping explosives to the keel. In December 1941, they crippled 2 British battleships, HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant, right there in the harbor of Alexandria, Egypt. Let that sink in. 2 of the Royal Navy's most powerful capital ships put out of action by 6 men in a harbor. If that had happened in the context of a healthy, coordinated military machine, the Decima MAS could have been one of the most feared special forces in the war. But Italy's military was a fractured, politically poisoned institution, strangled between Mussolini's delusions and an officer corps that spent more energy on internal politics than on the enemy. When Italy surrendered in September 1943, the unit literally split in 2, part fighting for the Allies, part fighting for the German-backed Italian Social Republic.
7. U.S. Marine Raiders. The Marine Raiders are a sensitive one because the men themselves were exceptional, handpicked, brutal in training, and deeply motivated. But the story of the Raiders is ultimately a cautionary tale about what happens when an institution doesn't know what to do with its own elite. They were stood up in 1942, modeled on the British commandos, and given a mandate for hit-and-run raids against Japanese-held islands. Their early operations at Macon and Guadalcanal showed what they could do: fast, violent strikes in and out before the enemy could react. The problem? The Marine Corps leadership, traditional, hierarchical, and deeply skeptical of the whole elite unit concept, kept reaching for them when they needed shock infantry. Macon was a raid, but Guadalcanal ground into months of attritional jungle fighting. The Raiders got fed into that meat grinder right alongside everyone else. Their specialized skills, their commando training, none of that matters when you're holding a defensive perimeter at night against banzai charges. By 1944, the 4 Raider battalions had suffered enormous casualties and were quietly disbanded, their men folded back into regular Marine infantry. The Raiders weren't a failure because the men were inadequate. They were a failure because the chain of command couldn't resist using a scalpel as a shovel.
The middle tier, specialists who mattered. 6. German Brandenburgers. If the war had gone differently, if Germany hadn't turned the corner from conquest to survival, the Brandenburgers might rank much, much higher. In the early years, they were astonishing. These were men who could speak the languages, wear the uniforms, and think like the enemy. In 1940, Brandenburger teams dressed as Dutch soldiers seized critical bridges across the Maas River before German armor even arrived, preventing demolition that could have stalled the entire Western campaign. In the opening hours of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, they dressed as Soviet troops, infiltrated Soviet lines, and prevented the destruction of bridges and infrastructure that the Wehrmacht desperately needed. Infiltration, deception, sabotage, seizing the objective before anyone knew they were there. That's special operations at its purest. But Hitler's Germany had a problem. It was running out of operational depth. By 1943, Germany was fighting on every front simultaneously, bleeding white. And when you're bleeding white, you stop treating your special operations troops as a strategic asset and start treating them as emergency infantry. The Brandenburgers were gradually reorganized into a conventional Panzer Grenadier division. A special operations unit that gets turned into regular infantry isn't a special operations unit anymore. It's a tragedy in uniform.
5. OSS Operational Groups. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, is the direct ancestor of both the CIA and U.S. Special Forces, and their operational groups deserve far more attention than they usually get. These weren't lone spies sipping martinis. OG teams were small, heavily armed combat units, typically 30 men or fewer, parachuting into occupied territory with one mission: find the resistance, arm them, train them, and unleash hell on the German rear. In France before D-Day, OSS teams were coordinating with the French Maquis, blowing up railway lines, assassinating collaborators, ambushing supply convoys. In northern Italy, they were working with partisan brigades that tied down entire German divisions that could have been fighting the Allied advance. In Yugoslavia, in Greece, and Burma, the OSS operational groups were the connective tissue between Allied strategic intent and local fury. What keeps them in the middle tier is reach and consistency. They were enormously effective in Europe, but their operations in Asia were patchier, and the organization itself was chronically underfunded and fighting bureaucratic wars with the Army and the State Department simultaneously. Wild Bill Donovan built something remarkable, but the building was still under construction when the war ended. What they became, that's another story entirely.
4. U.S. Army Rangers. The Rangers. 6 battalions. From the cliffs of Arzu in North Africa to the beaches of Sicily, from the mountains of Italy to the sands of Normandy. These men were among the finest light infantry America produced in the Second World War. Let's be honest about what the Rangers did at Pointe du Hoc on D-Day, June 6, 1944. They scaled 100-foot cliffs under fire using ropes and ladders, with Germans throwing grenades and shooting down at them point blank, took the position and held it for 2 days against German counterattacks, completely cut off, outnumbered, running low on ammunition. That is the stuff of legend, and it deserves to be. But the Rangers' story also has a dark chapter. Cisterna, January 1944, Italy. 2 Ranger battalions, nearly 800 men, were ordered to infiltrate through German lines to seize the town of Cisterna as part of the Anzio breakout. What nobody knew was that the Germans had anticipated the move. They walked straight into a trap. Of the roughly 767 Rangers who entered that crawl through the irrigation ditches, only 6 made it back. 6. The catastrophe at Cisterna wasn't the Rangers' failure. It was the failure of commanders who used a special operations force in a role it was never designed for: deep penetration of heavily defended lines without proper intelligence or support. Rangers lead the way, but they need to be pointed in the right direction.
3. First Special Service Force. The Black Devils. The Black Devils. That's what the Germans called them. And when your enemy invents a nickname for you that sounds like something from a nightmare, you know you're doing something right. The 1st Special Service Force was a joint American-Canadian unit, one of the very few truly combined combat formations of the entire war. Stood up in 1942, trained in the mountains of Montana for winter and mountain warfare, and then unleashed on the Italian campaign. Their defining moment came in December 1943 at Monte La Defensa, a 3,000-foot volcanic mountain in the Winterline, fortified by the Germans with interlocking fields of fire, thought by many commanders to be essentially impregnable. Previous attacks by multiple Allied divisions had failed completely. The Black Devils climbed the back face of the mountain at night, the face the Germans had decided no one could climb, and appeared at the summit at dawn. The Germans, facing an enemy that had come from the direction of the impossible, broke. After that, the force fought its way up the Italian peninsula in some of the ugliest, most grinding combat of the Western theater. They were so aggressive on night patrol, silently slitting into German positions, leaving cards that read, "Das dicke Ende kommt noch," the worst is yet to come, that Germans began deserting rather than hold positions near them. A combined force fighting in terrain most armies couldn't operate in, with a ferocity the enemy couldn't psychologically absorb. That's special operations done right.
The top tier, the game changers. 2. TIE, SOE and the Jedburgh teams, warfare from the shadows. Imagine you are the German High Command in the summer of 1944. You have roughly 300,000 troops in France. You have supply lines to maintain, rail networks to protect, telephone exchanges and power stations to keep operational. You have a continent to hold.
Now imagine that across every occupied country you control, there are invisible armies. Men and women who look like farmers and shopkeepers by day, who at night receive radio transmissions from London, receive drops of weapons and explosives from passing aircraft, and coordinate strikes against everything that holds your occupation together. That is what the British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, built. Churchill's instruction to the SOE when he created it in 1940 was simple and extraordinary. Set Europe ablaze. They came close. The SOE ran over 13,000 agents in occupied Europe. They blew up the heavy water plant at Vemork in Norway, setting back the Nazi atomic program by potentially years. They coordinated the French resistance into a force that, in the weeks after D-Day, conducted over 1,000 acts of sabotage against German rail and road networks, delaying the movement of an entire SS Panzer division, the Das Reich, by 2 full weeks on its way to Normandy. 2 weeks, at the moment when every hour mattered. The Jedburgh teams took this further. 3-man cells, 1 British, 1 American, 1 from the occupied country, parachuted blind into hostile territory to act as the direct link between London and the resistance on the ground. Hundreds of teams across dozens of countries coordinating the largest irregular warfare campaign in modern history. The SOE didn't just support the war. In places, they were the war.
2. Tie. The Chindits. Into the green hell. Most people in the West have barely heard of the Chindits. That is one of history's great injustices. Ord Wingate, eccentric, visionary, abrasive, brilliant, convinced British High Command in 1943 that you could supply and sustain a large fighting force entirely by air, operating deep inside Japanese-held Burma, no supply lines on the ground, no retreat to a rear area, just columns of men moving through some of the most brutal jungle on Earth, living on airdropped supplies and their own ferocity. The first Chindit expedition in 1943 was strategically inconclusive but proved the concept. The second, in 1944, was massive, over 9,000 men inserted by glider and transport aircraft directly into the Burmese jungle, building airstrips behind Japanese lines, establishing strongholds that the Japanese had to attack and that sucked in Japanese forces that could have been fighting elsewhere. At the Battle of the White City Stronghold, Chindit forces held a fortified position in the middle of Japanese-controlled territory for weeks, forcing multiple Japanese attacks, bleeding their logistics, disrupting the supply lines to Japanese forces fighting the British at Imphal and Kohima, battles that, if lost, would have opened the road to India. The jungle is the great equalizer. The Chindits went into it and refused to be stopped by it. In a theater where the Pacific War's full attention was rarely focused, they bent the campaign in Burma in ways that don't get taught in enough classrooms.
1. British SAS and SBS, the gold standard. There is a reason the Special Air Service still exists. There is a reason that virtually every Western Special Operations Force in the world today, the Delta Force, DevGRU, SASR, JTF-2, traces its doctrine, its philosophy, and in many cases its literal organizational structure back to what David Stirling built in the North African desert in 1941. Stirling's idea was elegant in its violence. Small teams, heavily armed, operating far behind enemy lines, hitting targets that conventional forces couldn't reach. Not raiding for the sake of raiding, destroying things that actually mattered, specifically aircraft. Between 1941 and 1943, SAS raiding parties, sometimes fewer than 10 men, drove jeeps armed with twin Vickers machine guns hundreds of miles through the desert at night, crept onto Axis airfields, placed time-delayed incendiary bombs on every aircraft they could reach, and disappeared back into the dark before anyone could react. In one particularly extraordinary period, the SAS destroyed more Axis aircraft on the ground than the RAF shot down in the air.
More aircraft destroyed on the ground than the entire Air Force shot down in combat. Read that again. The Special Boat Service, their maritime counterpart, was doing the same thing to Axis shipping across the Mediterranean, conducting raids on ports and coastal installations that kept entire German and Italian naval resources tied up in defensive postures. And when D-Day came, the SAS was there too, parachuted into France weeks before the landings, working with the French resistance, ambushing German columns, cutting communications, and making the German command's life a living nightmare in the crucial hours when the landings were still in the balance. The SAS and SBS didn't just win missions, they wrote the manual that the entire world is still using.
If you liked this video, I'm sure you'll like this one too. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Our channel is small, so we are replying every comment below.